Alright, what's up everyone? Undead Youth back again. I know it's been a really long time, but I'm back to making videos again, and so today I'm going to be throwing at you guys my Vengeance Demon Hunter guide for 7.1. We're just going to do this all in one take because that is how I feel like my videos are best done, and we'll have some gameplay footage going on in the background, as I'm sure you can already see. So we're just going to talk about what makes a Demon Hunter a good tank, why you should pick one, how we play it, how our artifacts and our talents work together, and then what the finished product is so you can be successful in mythics, heroics, raids, and everything else that you want to do with your Demon Hunter, because they really are a great class. So let's just dive right in because we have a lot to talk about. So first, let's just talk about what makes a Demon Hunter tank different than a warrior or a paladin or a death knight or anything like that, and why you'd want to play it. Right, so what makes Demon Hunters different are that they are a self-healing based class largely, so they are much more akin to your Death Knights than they are to something like a sword and board tank like a paladin or a warrior. So they rely on taking less smooth damage overall, but are able to actually respond to spikier damage by healing themselves up, which can be really nice just for being able to help your healers, number one, and also being able to respond to damage as it's incoming, rather than just sort of having to wait and hope you have enough block chance to do this and do that. Rather, you're just, you might take more damage overall, but you have the ability to respond to it accordingly, and you have the tools yourself to do so without having your heroes waste mana, so it's really cool there. Also, we do a ton of damage. The big thing with Demon Hunters, once you get the artifact fleshed out, is that the more damage you do, the more healing you do. So we are just destroying trash packs and 5-mans, along with all of the other really strong AoE DPS classes out there, which is very important when you get into higher tier mythics, where the trash is just as hard as the bosses. Not to say that we can't do respectable single target damage as well. So those are some of the reasons why I like to play my Demon Hunter. The increased mobility is very good, especially in later affixes and mythic plus, like volcanic or necrotic, when kiting is not only something that is a thing, but it's also actually very important. You are the kite master. There are a lot of times where in Violet Hold, like if your entire group wipes except for you can actually kite all the mobs away, jump over to the crystals, kill the ads, and then give your group time to regroup. Crazy things like that, which will eventually come up when you do a ton of those, especially a ton of pugs. But stuff you never even think about with other classes, you can actually do with your Demon Hunter, so it's really neat. So that's why I play a Demon Hunter, and why I really enjoy it as a tanking class. But more onto how we actually tank. So what really and truly sets other tanks apart is not the thematic things that go on with your tanks, but it's how they actually deal with damage. That will actually be the deciding factor that most really good players use to determine which tank they'll pick up in main for an expansion, and what most groups, what big guilds will look for in a tank coming up into the next expansion. So you want to understand how your class deals with incoming damage. So as opposed to, like I said, other classes which have passive ways of mitigating damage, we don't. We just have active mitigation. And our active mitigation is in the form of Demon Spikes. And what Demon Spikes does is it increases your parry chance for the next few seconds after you activate it, consumed by pain, which is a resource that we have that is just built by using abilities and then spent by using other abilities, kind of like Rage. And we'll use Demon Spikes to reduce our physical incoming damage, and our parry chance increases when we use it too. So it's a very powerful active mitigation tool, probably more powerful than some of the other ones because of the fact that it twofold kind of double dips in defensive nature, because it also just flat out reduces your damage like something like Shield of the Righteous would do, but it also gives you the chance to avoid damage altogether by having that parry as well. So it can be very nice in a situation where you're being hit by a lot of physical attacks at once, like dungeons. Demon Spikes is very important there, but it's also very good against boss hits, because as opposed to something like in the old days where you would have something like Savage Defense, which was a very high increased dodge chance, which if you got lucky and actually did dodge the attack that a boss would throw at you, it was very effective. But when you didn't, you still got hit for the full brunt of it, and it wasn't very fun. And the same thing that Brewmasters are finding right now. Dodge is just not a reliable mechanic in and of itself. But with with Demon Hunters, you don't have to worry about that, because yes, you have the parry chance, and that's great, but you also have the flat damage reduction to boost it back up. So even those attacks that don't get parried, they will still be able to be reduced in damage somehow, which is nice. And there are certain attacks which you're just not going to parry. You're not going to be able to, but if it's a physical attack, you will still reduce the damage. So it's very, very nice. And then you also have the other side of the coin of when you're not taking physical damage, you're taking magical damage, like a breath from a boss. There are quite a few breaths in Emerald Nightmare and in dungeons in general, and caster trash, and those are really important. We have empowered wards for that, which is just a flat magic damage reduction on a small cooldown. It doesn't last very long. It's pretty much only for like one instance, so like that big major breath attack, but it is on a relatively short cooldown, so you more than likely will have it to sync up with just about every big magical breath that you should have to deal with, which is all we really need it for, which is fine. And then finally you have your third form of active mitigation, which is not really mitigation at all, but it does consume your resource to deal with damage, and that is Soul Cleave. And Soul Cleave will consume up to 60 pain, and from there you will strike all enemies in front of you in a cone, and then you will actually heal yourself for a set amount up to, I think with my gear, I don't know if it changes via gear, I guess it would changes via attack power actually. With mine it's like 300 and something thousand healing, so up to the amount of pain that you absorb, up to 60. So basically this is the ability that you're going to use when it falls into one of the other categories, where it's not physical damage that you need, it's not magical damage that you need, or either one of those two abilities are on cooldown, because you can't keep either one of them up 100% of the time. So your health is eventually going to dip low. There's eventually going to be physical attacks you don't parry. There's eventually going to be magic damage you don't have empowered wards for, but you can use Soul Cleave to bring yourself back up. And so it forms a really nice cohesive unit of dealing with damage there in those three abilities. So something to bear in mind. Another resource that we have outside of pain, however, is your soul fragments, okay, and they're very important. So what soul fragments are these little purple orbs that you'll see throughout the video going on here as well, that can spawn in one of two ways. So you have two different types of soul fragments. You have just soul fragments, and then you have lesser soul fragments. Soul fragments are actually gained anytime you kill an enemy that grants experience or honor, and then it will drop a big ass soul fragment. And this is really cool because if you absorb it, you get a big ass heal, and if it's a demon soul, you get 15% damage increase, I believe. So not a very sizable amount of damage increase from it, but it's not reliable because you actually have to land the killing blow, and that's not very likely in raids and when you're dealing with just one boss the entire time, or if you're just doing trash, you're probably on to the next trash pack before things are dying anyway. So you do have a much more reliable way to get soul fragments, and that is in your lesser soul fragments, which are actually generated by using certain other abilities, and they'll fall off randomly from your targets, and some abilities you have actually will generate a set number of them. And so what happens is they're very similar. They just give you a smaller heal, and they do still give you a damage bonus if you were to absorb a demon soul as well. And what's really cool about these guys is when you use Soul Cleave, when you have soul fragments out, Soul Cleave will actually suck up all of those soul fragments for you, so you don't have to try to run over them like a Brewmaster would have had to try to earlier with their gift of the Ox Orbs, especially because soul fragments spawn in very random locations and are rarely ever right at your feet. So the much more efficient way to do it is to use Soul Cleave. It will suck all of them up. So not only do you get the heal from Soul Cleave itself, there's also a talent that we'll talk about that gives you a hot with Soul Cleave. You'll also get the heal as if you were consuming all of those soul fragments, lesser or greater. They'll all be sucked in when you use Soul Cleave. So Soul Cleave has the potential to heal you for a lot, right? So you shouldn't worry about those moments in between your active mitigations being up or relevant, because you always have Soul Cleave. And you're also going to use Soul Cleave when you're at 80 plus pain, and you don't need to use those other abilities. So an instance very simple is if you're tanking a single target boss and you're off tanking and you just want to do damage, Soul Cleave does a ton of damage too. So Soul Cleave is just always going to be there for you as well. And really there's not much that you can do with your soul fragments. There's not a whole lot of control you can have over them. There are some talents which generate them. There's some things that kind of work with them, and there are really relevant when we start talking about our artifact trait, but at the end of the day it's pretty RNG as to how they are generated, but they're there. So we talked about our two resources. We've talked about soul fragments, and we talked about pain. How do we generate both of these things? Well, you're going to use an ability called Shear to generate both pain and soul fragments. Shear is an ability that has absolutely no cooldown and no resource cost, but it can generate it will generate pain 100% of the time every time you use it, and it has a chance to shear off a soul fragment from your target as well every time you use it. So there is absolutely no reason not to be pressing a button all the time. As a Vengeance Demon Hunter, you always have to be pressing shear if nothing else is relevant. Always, always, always. And then you have Immolation Aura, another way by default to generate pain, and can be talented to also generate soul fragments as well. And it is just an aura that goes around you that damages everything around you for the next few seconds, and while it's active, you generate pain. You want to use Immolation Aura on cooldown above all else because of the fact that it generates pain, but it's much more efficient than shear because its pain is generated over time. All you have to do is hit the button to start the process, and you'll just passively generate pain and do damage, as opposed to shear, which you have to give up the global to actually use shear when you could be using other defensive or offensive abilities. So Immolation Aura is just much more convenient for you, so you should get used to using that on cooldown. So just all other things aside, we can just build up our rotation as two things, right? Generate pain through using shear and through using Immolation Aura, and then you spend it by using Soul Cleave and Demon Spikes, and then in between you'll use Empowered Wards, which actually doesn't have a resource cost, it's just a cooldown. So very simple, and if the class was just that, then we really wouldn't have any reason for this video. So there's actually a lot more things that we can add on to our rotation before we go off and talk about artifacts, and those are just random, sort of offensive and utility abilities. Utilities are actually really, really important to your Demon Hunter and what make it so good in dungeon content. It's less so in raids because you don't get to use a lot of the utility things that we're going to talk about, but it's still really important in dungeons because you will make your run so much smoother by using a lot of the things we're going to mention in a few. But let's round out talking about some other DPS abilities and cooldowns that you have. So your cooldowns are twofold by default. You have Fiery Brand and you have Metamorphosis. So Fiery Brand is actually a really, really strong damage mitigation tool where you do a massive amount of damage to a target and inflict a debuff on them. While they have that debuff on them, they deal 40% less damage to you. Very important to note, though, it's not a buff on you, it's not 40% damage reduction like Shield Wall will be, but it is 40% damage reduction from that target onto you while that is active, but it also does a massive amount of damage, and it's on a relatively short cooldown as well, so be pretty liberal when you use this because it's up all the time. And definitely respect it for the damage tool that it is. It does do a lot of damage in and of itself, but respect it for the mitigation tool that it is, and try not to use it as a DPS cooldown too much, even though there are some artifact traits that would make you want to do that. Just keep that in mind. And then you also have Metamorphosis. Metamorphosis is your big cooldown that lets everybody know there's a bam fucking Vengeance Demon Hunter in your group. And so what this does is when you activate it, it increases your current and your maximum health. So basically it's a last stand when you activate it passively. There's a pug in the background. But it's a last stance when you activate it passively, right? And then it also constantly generates pain throughout the entire duration. Much like Immolation Aura. It's kind of like having Immolation Aura all the time, but you just don't get the extra damage from it kind of deal, which is pretty neat. So what's going to happen is you'll pop this and you'll constantly be generating pain, so you'll be able to use more Demon Spikes more liberally, and you'll be able to Soul Cleave more regularly, so you'll be able to do more damage and more healing. So it's a very powerful cooldown. It's very fun as well. It's one of the more fun tanking cooldowns in the game, as opposed to something that just might change your appearance a little bit, but just really does damage, mitigation, or things like that. This has an active component where you'll get the most out of it if you're actually actively hitting buttons and doing things. I don't know what my dogs are doing, but it scares me when they like circle around things. So I'm like totally watching them. Alright, it seems like they're okay. But anyway, so Metamorphosis is huge, and you want to use this. You can use it defensively. It's definitely best to use it defensively, so you can actually get the bonus out of the min and max health increase, but also it's a decent offensive cooldown as well. If something just needs to die, the increased pain will be more damage, which is always good. So that's meta for you. Then you have utility in the form of your sigils. Your sigils are really cool. They're targeted ground effect AoEs that are placed on the ground, and then a few seconds after you place them, they actually explode and you actually get the effect of them. And so you have 3 by default. You have the Sigil of Flame, which is just a AoE that you place on the ground. In a few seconds it will explode and apply a dot to everything that's in the side of that circle, which will do fire damage to them, which is more important when we talk about our artifact. and it's just obviously very good. It has the shortest cooldown of all of your sigils, so it actually pretty much becomes a part of your damage rotation because of the fact that it does a ton of damage, especially to a lot of mobs, and it can be used to freely place and pull things where you need them. Then you also have Sigil of Silence, which is an AoE targeted silence, which is phenomenal. No other tank that I know of at least has this, and it's so good for pulling things, positioning things, even just dropping it on your own location mid-pull to stop the damage from caster mobs. It is phenomenal. Use this often and as creatively and as inventively as you can for pulling mobs towards you. You have a ton of range tools as a demon hunter, and even the ability to jump in range. So you should never really be caught out by caster mobs. You also, of course, have consume magic, so you have your own interrupt, just a singular interrupt that will, when it successfully interrupts, gives you 50 pain. So it is a survivability increase to interrupt for yourself. So you have a ton of really potent utility and you need to use it. And then you also have your Sigil of Misery, which I believe is like an AoE incapacitate, which is nice to have as well. A couple of other tanks have it, and it's always a welcome addition to any toolkit. And then you can have one more sigil in the form of Sigil of Flames, which are Sigil of Chains, which is a talent, which is like Gorfine's Grasp on a much smaller radius and a little bit harder to use, but it's still there if you need it. So your sigils are great, and like I said, during a dungeon they are phenomenal for controlling things. During a raid, you're not going to use them as much, but it's still really nice to have them as well, because there often be mobs that will enter the fight and you can very easily deal with them too. So that is the majority of the buttons that you will be pressing as a Vengeance Demon Hunter. We can also talk about Infernal Strike. Infernal Strike is basically like your movement abilities, your heroic leap, and you can talent it so that you can use it much more often. It's a great gap closer and a great pull. It does do damage when you land, so that's nice, and you can even beef it up with your talents even more. And then you also have your artifact ability, which is Soul Carver, and what Soul Carver does is really interesting. So Soul Carver hits your target really hard up front for a bunch of fire damage and leaves a debuff on them that will do more fire damage over time. And every 1 second while that debuff is on the target, it will shed 1 lesser soul fragment. So this is a guaranteed way of getting soul fragments, which is nice because it will pair with a lot of things that we talk about later. At the very least, it just has a very bare bones synergy with Soul Carver and Soul Cleave. Right? So you want a Soul Carver pretty much on cooldown. Just be mindful that it does leave a debuff on the target, so its full potential will be realized when the target lives for its entire duration. So don't put it on something that's about to die in a trash pack. That's just about the only consideration you really need to make. Other than that, you want to use it as much as you possibly can, because that will generate you more soul fragments over the course of a fight, which is more healing and more other things, X things depending on your talent setup, and also more fire damage, which is very important as well. So there's Soul Carver there, and you also have Throw Glaive, which is another one of those range pulling tools I was talking about. Also have this Keybound because it's really nice. It is a range tool that does a lot of threat and a decent amount of damage that you can use. It has no resource cost or anything. Hits 3 targets, so it's like your own mini Avenger shield. It's so cool. Like, we have such a robust toolkit that you should never really be caught out by anything in a dungeon whatsoever. So that's pretty much all that there really is to know about your other abilities. So now we can kind of move on. Normally I would talk about talents next, because that affects your rotation, but before we talk about talents, I want to talk about our artifact weapon and its traits, because it is by far the most defining thing about the spec and creates this amazing synergy between your core toolkit, artifact, talent, boom, Vengeance Demon Hunter. So we really need to understand how our artifact is going to change things, right? So if we can, I'm going to pull it up here so I know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not going to go through all the minor traits because there are some that need to be talked about, but not a lot. But basically, you're going to go to the left side of your tree and head straight for the first Golden Dragon trait, which is Fueled by Pain. What Fueled by Pain does is every single time you have a chance, or every single time you absorb a soul fragment, you have a chance to pop into meta for the next 5 seconds. I told you those soul fragments were going to be important, didn't I? This is why. Okay, so when you do this, you'll just pop into meta every time that you absorb a soul fragment again. It's like a 5% chance, which is not that bad, especially considering the fact that you will be dealing with a lot of soul fragments doing your normal rotation. So what this means is that you'll randomly be getting more health and more pain, which is more pain over the course of a fight or a dungeon, which means more soul cleaves, more demon spikes, more healing, more damage. So it's all very good. And then there are further talents which buff the actual healing that you can get to yourself when you're in meta. So it just comes, there are these spiky moments where you are invincible you are absolutely invincible. And so Fuel by Pain helps initiate that, and it's really great just when you look at it over the course of a fight. It's not super reliable, like if you're just saying, okay, I'm gonna go up in this trash pack, and I might get super unlucky and never proc Fuel by Pain in a trash pack. Usually it pops once per trash pack for me, but whatever. I might get that unlucky where it never happens in that one trash pack. But if you look at it over the course of the fight and how much health that gives you, how much healing it does because of it's unquantifiable because it's so, different, but it's so good at the same time. So you definitely want to go ahead and get that because it will help overall keep things pretty smooth for you over the course of a fight. And when you go through that, you're also going to pass through Fiery Demise to get to Fuel by Pain. Fiery Demise is a really important minor trait, which I don't feel I need to talk too much about because it's something you have to get anyway to get Fuel by Pain, but it's very important because it will also change how you do things. So Fiery Demise, when you put Fiery Brand on your target, you increase the amount of damage that they take by your fire spells by a large amount. This is what kind of turns Sigil of Flame into a pseudo DPS cooldown, and it gets to be really potent when we start to add on as well. So I just wanted to go through that. Then you're going to go to the right and you're going to go to Charred Warblades. Charred Warblades is an absolutely fundamental thing that you need to know. This is why I wanted to talk about this tree before we talk about your talents, because Charred Warblades will permeate every decision you make as a Vengeance Demon Hunter. What it does is once you get this Golden Dragon, you heal yourself for 15% of all fire damage that you do. That's amazing. If you don't know, you do a lot of fire damage as a Vengeance Demon Hunter. Sigil of Flame obviously does fire damage. Immolation Aura does fire damage. Soul Cleave does fire damage. Soul Carver does fire damage. Fellblade, when you pick it up, does fire damage. Fell Devastation, when you pick it up, does fire damage. I believe Infernal Strike does fire damage, and if not, you can talent it to do fire damage. You do a ton of fire damage. Fiery Brand does fire damage. Now it makes a lot more sense that we have a DP, like a damage reduction cooldown, that instead of being a buff to us is a damaging debuff to a target because it does fire damage. And this ties back to Fiery Demise right then and there, which will increase the amount of fire damage that you do to a target that does have Fiery Brand. So not only is that target dealing less damage to you while Fiery Brand is on it, it's also healing you for more because you're doing more damage to it. Charred Warblades is absolutely amazing. Is 15% a great number? No. But when you think about how much fire damage you do over the course of the fight, it has to be that way just to keep it from being absolutely busted. But it is a phenomenal amount of healing over the course of a fight. Will it save your life? No. But it helps smooth you out. It doesn't make you tankier because it doesn't at all directly impact the amount of damage that you take. You still take the same amount of damage when you have Charred Warblades up. And in fact, if you're at max health and you have an Absorb Shield on yourself from either yourself or a Disc Priest or something like that, you're not even getting any benefit out of Charred Warblades. But the fact of the matter is that it smooths out your damage because it gives you healing constantly and consistently. But it becomes even more relevant when you're taking spikier damage because you're taking a bunch of adds in a dungeon, because there's also going to be a bunch more fire damage going out. There's going to be more targets affected by Sigil of Flames, more targets hit by Immolation, or more targets hit by a bunch of other things like Fell Devastation. So you're going to be healing for so much from Charred Warblades. So it absolutely permeates everything you do to the point where now you can start thinking, once you pick up Charred Warblades, a lot of the other fire abilities that you can pick through your talent tree will make more sense. If you don't have it, like you're just starting out or you're just moving from Havoc over to this, then maybe you can get away with not picking some of those things. But as soon as you get Charred Warblades, all the fire stuff becomes almost mandatory. But it even it's just something that you really want to try to maximize to the point where it changes your school of thought, the class in general. This has been something that tanks have been kind of sort of thinking about and messing around with for the longest time, where the idea is, okay, I can worry about living or I can worry about doing damage, and if I'm not about to die, I should probably just be worried about doing damage. It's even more so with the Vengeance Demon Hunter because of the fact that, guess what? While I'm doing damage, I'm also healing. So really, unless I am about to die, I should be trying to do as much DPS as possible, and I should be building myself talent-wise to do as much DPS as possible, because that will do as much healing as possible. that makes any sense. So very cohesive, and that's what I love about the spec. It's super cohesive and makes just a ton of sense when you think about all the stuff that's going on. You'll also have the ability to get another minor trait, which is, what is that? Demonic Flames, I think that's what it is, which increases the fiery brand by 2 seconds as well, which is very important for more fire damage. So pick that up too. And so then you have 2 other ways you can do it. You can go back to the start of your tree, and you can go straight for Pangbringer, which is your 3rd golden dragon, which is very cool. Pangbringer just reduces the amount of damage that you take every time you absorb a soul fragment. So yay, more soul fragments energy. And this will make you, this is like the only thing that makes you tankier, right? It is very important though, and once you can get it, you will be super solid. And you'll also pass through defensive spikes, which is another favorite of mine in the tier, which will increase your parry chance for the first few seconds while you have demon spikes active. And I am a huge advocate of demon spikes because I do a lot of dungeon stuff and not nearly as much raid. I do raid, but I do more dungeons than anything else. So that's really neat as well. Or you could hold off on that. Of course, you'll eventually get there. Our point is to eventually fill out the whole tree, but you can hold off on that, and you can actually go for, I believe it's called Devour the Souls or something weird like that, which will actually, what it does is it will increase the healing that Soul Cleave does, which is very important, because when you're Soul Cleaving a lot, it is going to be the way we're going to do with those in-between moments in damage mitigation, so having an extra heal in it is really good. So that's your artifact tree in a nutshell in terms of traits, item level. I mean, not traits, relics, item level, just item level. There's just don't ever think about it that much. I mean, if you had to have the choice between a bunch of different ones of the same item level, as long as it's not something ridiculous that's like, oh, buff Infernal Strike damage, like nobody gives a shit about that. But you want to try for things that are going to increase your survivability. So like the relics that I have in right now are both actually Fiery Demise. I have 2 Fiery Demise traits in there in my relic slot. So my Fiery Demise is really big, so like my damage during those windows is really high and my healing is really high. And it's really awesome for burst healing, but there are some other things that I could probably take to smooth my damage. But it doesn't really matter. I didn't actively go for that. That's just what happens to have the highest item level for me, and that's what I'm going with. So that's really cool. So now we've gotten that out of the way. Now you understand why doing fire damage, really important. So now let's talk about our talents, okay? So I'm gonna go and try my absolute best to talk about what talents will be used in what situation. So I am going to spend a lot of time here talking about the merits of each one, because Vengeance is really weird in that all of its talents are good in a situation. Like, they're pretty fucking good. They're good in a specific situation of an encounter, or they're just good if you want that playstyle. So let's just go ahead and talk about them, because we have a lot to go through. So we have Abyssal Strike, right? So Abyssal Strike will increase, I think it is the radius, and reduce the cooldown of your Infernal Strike. So you can use Infernal Strike more often and farther. This is really great in open world stuff like world quests and leveling. And it can also have some merit in dungeons where you're just pulling and chain pulling. And there's also another talent that will add even more weight to your Abyssal Strike, your Infernal Strike, to the point where it marries really well with Abyssal Strike. But in general, it loses out to the next one in the tier, which is Agonizing Flame, which is the default. As much as Blizzard tries to not make it the default, they should not have put this either in this tier or made it anywhere near as good as it is. But because what it does is it increases your Immolation Aura's damage by 30%. Used to be 50, they nerfed it by a whopping 20%, still the best. 30% increased damage on Immolation Aura, and it will increase your movement speed, which is largely irrelevant. This is huge, just because you're going to be using Immolation Aura a lot, especially if you're doing dungeons. There's going to be a lot of enemies around you to be dealt more damage, and of course, if that is the case, then guess what? That's more Char Warblades healing. Done and done. Definitely going to be the default. But if you are purely single targeting something, then maybe Razor Spikes is for you. When Demon Spikes is active, you deal 20% increased physical damage, right? And your targets that attack you are slowed. Okay, so if it was just damage, this would be pretty darn good. Probably maybe better than Agonizing Flame at that point in time, but this doesn't buff your Char Warblades healing, but it's still pretty good on a pure single target where you're just going to be using Demon Spikes a lot, and that's it, because of the fact that Agonizing Flames just gets immeasurably better the more targets there are. Razor Spikes might pull ahead simming on a pure single target, but that's it, and I wouldn't usually take that one, even if that were the case. really agonizing flames is just set and forget for just about every scenario, raiding, dungeons, everything except for maybe world stuff, because Abyssal Strike will help you get around. And there's one other time you would take Abyssal Strike, and that's if you take another talent further down in the tree. Okay, so moving on to the next tier, we have Feast of Souls, which means that your Soul Cleave will apply hot. Like I said, this just buffs Soul Cleave that much more, to the point where now you're healing from Soul Cleave itself, you're healing from the Soul Fragments, and you're healing from Charred Warblades as well, and you're healing from this hot. So tons of healing coming out from Soul Cleave here. This is really nice on single target boss fights, because the next two abilities really only become worth if you're fighting more than one target, and this is pretty much the go-to if you're just fighting one target. It's very good. This is also really nice if you're dealing with a situation where there are going to be times where you're off-tanking the boss. You're going to be using Soul Cleave because you're going to want to add damage, right? That's obvious. But one really, really important thing that Feast of Souls also does is it adds that hot on. So say something like Ursoc, where you're tanking the boss, then you're not tanking the boss, but you still have debuffs on you that are doing damage to you. Soul Cleave will try its best now, whenever you use it, to apply that hot and try to offset some of that damage by giving you a nice little hot. So it's nice. It's just something that will passively be healing you. It'll also help you deal with AoE damage that comes in randomly through certain things. So it'll just be trying to heal you up. So that's cool. And then you have Fallout, which is my default pick of the tier because I do mostly dungeons. So what this does is the initial burst of Immolation Aura has a chance to shed Lesser Soul Fragments, which is very, very important, because we talked about all the things that get proc from Lesser Soul Fragments. We talked about the heal, the damage, we talked about Fuel by Pain, we talked about the fact that if you take Painbringer will respond to it as well. It's all very important, and I take another talent in this tier that further augments that. So it's very good in dungeons. You'll get a ton of soul fragments in a decent sized pack, and in those bigger packs, it's absolutely phenomenal, right? So those bigger packs like shitty mobs, or like I'm thinking a lot of things in Vault of the Wardens, the first few packs that you deal with, and then going up the stairs with all the bats, popping Immolation Aura when you have a bunch of mobs in Fallout is crazy. And then finally you have Burning Alive. Burning Alive is super interesting, and this is not going to be one that I think you're going to go with unless you have your artifact relatively fleshed out on the left hand side. What it does is that your Fiery Brand every 2 seconds will move from its initial target to another target. This is really cool and has the chance to be really good. Obviously this only matters at all on multiple targets. Even Fallout can still be used to shed one more lesser soul fragment than you would normally be able to shed, because you have that one target in front of you, even on a single target boss. And obviously Feast of Souls is good on a single target, but this is literally only relevant on multiple target fights, like dungeons or council style fights. Interesting thing is, you really have to understand how this ability works mechanically. Number one, it can obviously just be good because it spreads that 40% damage reduction to all these things around you, which is really strong, right? You would think it's just great. You should just choose it. But the thing is, it doesn't automatically just, boop, everybody has Fiery Brand. No, it spreads from the initial target. So it takes 2 seconds to spread to every target. So it's not going to reach its full amount until pretty much your Fiery Brand has lived out its full duration on your target. So number one, your initial target has to live the entire time Fiery Brand is up. Has to live, because it does not spread from every target. So for instance, if I have target A and I apply Fiery Brand to them, it will move from target A to target B. It will not then move from target B to target C. It will move from target A to target C. It only spreads from where you initially apply Fiery Brand. So that mob must live, which is not impossible to do in dungeons, but it's a lot less likely than in something like a council style fight where it's just a bunch of bosses and you know they'll all live. You need to be very discerning if you're going to try to use this on, and make sure you're getting that mob that's going to be alive long. Then you also need to realize that this becomes better when you start to flesh out your tier more. Number one, obviously if you have Charred Warblades, this is going to be cool. If you have Fiery Demise, like remember I have 2 Fiery Demise relics, so I'm increasing the damage that all these guys have been taking by my fire stuff, so I drop a Sigil of Flame on them after this. Tons of damage. So it can be used as a really nice DPS cooldown as well in that regard. And once you get the fiery, I forget what it's called, something Demonic Flames I think it is, which increases your Fiery Brand's duration by, guess what? 2 seconds. Yeah, you got it. That's a whole nother jump for this talent, so it can be really good if you get that too. And it's not really going to be good to flesh out your artifact trait, unfortunately. So if you're just starting out, this is more than likely not one you're ever going to touch. In fact, I don't even use it now, and I have all of those traits because I just find Fallout 2 is generally better. But it can potentially be really good. And if there was just that one council fight where you're tanking maybe 2 targets all the time, this is really powerful. This is really strong damage reduction and DPS cooldown on them. But other than that, the other 2 are going to always win out. So then you have Fellblade in the next tier. Fellblade is just an ability that is reduced by haste. Its cooldown is reduced by haste, that generates pain, 20 pain, and has a chance to be reset every time you shear. This is awesome because it's another way to generate pain outside of the 2 that we have by default. It's another button to press in our rotation, which, believe it or not, Vengeance really needs that. And it charges the target too, so you don't have to be right on the target when you use it. It actually is a little bit of a movement speed thing too, which is nice because typically I find myself Infernal Striking out of the way of some ground AoE or whatever, and then I can Fellblade back in, so I don't have to worry about wasting both of my Infernal Strikes, which is relevant when you start to add Infernal Striking to your actual rotation. Okay, so it's really nice, and in general, it's my go-to pick for everything, both single target and AoE, just for the extra pain. It's mostly for the extra pain that I really like it. The other 2 can be more useful potentially, but I just like the extra pain. Then you have Flame Crash. Okay, now Flame Crash is interesting. This is the one I was talking about that pairs really well with Abyssal Strike. So Flame Crash, whenever you use Infernal Strike, where you land, it will automatically spawn a Sigil of Flame. So basically this gives you 3 Sigil of Flames at any given point in time, as opposed to the normal 1 that you would get within the same amount of time. This is cool. It's probably not going to be a ton of Charred Warblades healing, like a ton extra Charred Warblades healing, but it is going to be more if you're really good at using it on cooldown and you can get all of them in a given trash pack. But in general, it is a ton of AoE damage that you would normally not have, especially if you take Fellblade over it. And then it does give you more Charred Warblades healing, but it requires that you then use Infernal Strike as a part of your rotation, which means it almost requires Abyssal Strike to get the most out of it, which means that you're giving up Agonizing Flames. That's the real kicker. This is fine in and of itself, but if you're going to take it, you really need to be taking Abyssal Strike. And if you're taking Abyssal Strike, even then, even the combination of Flame Crash and Abyssal Strike is probably not better than Agonizing Flame in any situation where you would want to use Flame Crash, because it's an AoE situation and an Agonizing Flame is just better. Just for the damage that it does straight up without having to think about it, without having to manage it, without having to target it, and the healing that it will do, again, without having to do any of those things. So if you want to play with this, and I played with this playstyle before, you can actually see it at the beginning in the first part, like the first video. You can see I was playing with it, but I was just trying it out. But it can be really fun, but I don't think it's the most optimal way to play for any situation. And then if I have Fell Eruption, you're not going to take Fell Eruption. And then in the next tier you have Feed the Demon, which means that consuming a soul fragment reduces the remaining cooldown of your demon spikes by 2 seconds. I love this ability, and this is my pick of the tier when you're doing raids and stuff like, or not raids, when you're doing dungeons, again, because demon spikes is so powerful. And it can, again, be very synergistic with Racer Spikes if you want to take it, though I wouldn't go that far. But as long as you're taking Fallout to make sure that you're generating the maximum amount of soul fragments that you can at any given point in time, especially in AoE, I really like this because that extra parry chance is going to be really, really important when there are a ton of mobs swinging on you really fast, as opposed to bosses, which usually have a much slower swing timer, and there's less parryable stuff going on from a boss. So I really like this during dungeons. You can get a ton of mileage out of your demon spikes in general, and so Feed the Demon's really nice for that. And then you can also choose Fracture, which is just a single target ability that generates 2 soul fragments. It's nice to be able to have control of your soul fragments in some way, shape, or form between this and Soul Carver. It's nice, but it does cost pain, and right now I'm not to the point where I'm super pain capped a lot of the times. If you are super pain capped a lot of the times, Fracture is probably going to be really good for you, but I don't find that I'm there very often. In fact, I'm more starved than anything else the majority of the time, so I don't feel I need to use Fracture ever. And then you have Soul Rending. Soul Rending is the other one. If you're not going to take Feed the Demon, you're probably going to take Soul Rending. So Soul Rending, what it does is while you're meta, you gain 30% leech, which is huge. So, like, again, you already pretty much have leech when it comes to Charred Warblades. Anyway, you pretty much already have leech. But you're also going to just get straight up leech, so every bit of damage you do will heal you. So you really can't die when you're in meta, for the most part. This is huge when you couple it with Fueled by Pain, because guess what? Then Fueled by Pain, you're just going to randomly pop in and out of meta, so you're randomly going to get a ton of healing. It's great. It's absolutely great, especially in raids. It's pretty much the go-to. Then you have a sigils tier, right? And so it pretty much just comes down to how much you care about your sigils, right? You have concentrated sigils, which will drop sigils on your location instead of having to target them. There's 2 reasons why you would ever use concentrated sigils. Number 1 is if you're on a single target fight like Ursoc, where you're never going to move and literally just saving yourself the time it would take you to place your sigils, and you're only ever really going to use Sigil Flame in that regard anyway. So literally just saving yourself the time it would take you to take your sigil to place your sigils might potentially let you do other things. That's the only time you would ever take it, and there's only one fight like that I can think of, and that's Ursoc, when your sigils don't matter at all. And so, hey, at least now you're just saving yourself the moment it would take you to target and to apply it. So fine. And the second situation that you would ever use concentrated sigils is if you just don't give a fuck about your sigils, which you're probably playing the class wrong if you don't, or if you don't give a fuck. Your sigils are amazing. This is the I don't give a fuck talent of the tier, and you're never really gonna take it like I said outside of Ursoc. So then there is Sigil of Chains, which is basically Gorfine's Grasp, but in sigil form. The radius is much smaller. The cooldown is probably the same, something like that. And you have to wait because it will be a moment between when you place it and when it actually activates. So you have to time it really, really well. Because of all those stipulations, it's much harder to use than Gorfine's Grasp. It's not impossible. It's still pretty good. There are a couple of trash packs that just don't want to stay still, like the jumping centaur bitches in Darkheart Thicket, and then also the pelter motherfuckers, the guys that are like throwing bricks, like fuck the system, throwing bricks guys in Neltharian's Lair, and also like various other mobs that will pull other ones. So sigil chains can be useful if you can get it to work. I have no luck with this ever, so I just say fuck it, and I'll just try to survive without it. And obviously in raids, probably not going to be that good. So usually the go-to in raids and in 5-pans, for me at least, is Quicken Sigils, which just reduces the cooldown of all of your sigils, which is nice because you have a reduced cooldown on your DPS one and a reduced cooldown on your silence one, which is very cool. And then also reduces the amount of time that it takes for them to activate, so they're pretty much instantaneous. So that's really neat as well, and it just makes them overall quality of life just easier to use. So the only time that you wouldn't take this should be your baseline. The only time you wouldn't take it is either it doesn't matter about your sigil at all, which would be in a single target standing still patchwork boss fight, or if you really need to control mobs, then a Sigil of Chains. So, moving on, you have some sort of like DPS and healing-ish ability in this next tier. The default pick for me is Fell Devastation. It's a 1-minute cooldown, does a ton of damage in a frontal cone in front of you, roots you to the ground, and it channels it. But you do heal while you do a massive amount of damage. So this is a massive amount of burst fire damage, which will also turn Warblades heal you. It's very strong. You can mow down a bunch of mobs with this. You can also use it on a single target to do a ton of damage and a ton of healing. It's just very good for burst healing. You should never really die because of the massive amount of healing that you get when you Fell Devastation. So it's my default pick, and it looks BA too because you turn into a demon. I don't know if I can actually do it right now. God, I love it. It's so cool. Sorry. Anyway, you guys probably couldn't even see that, but you'll definitely see it in the videos because it's my default. Then you also have Blade Turning. You're never going to take Blade Turning, so just don't even worry about it. And then you have Spirit Bomb, which, so basically this means that every single time you use Spirit Bomb, you launch a soul fragment at a target, and then you will hit that target, do damage to it and everything around it, and apply what's called frailty to them. And every time you are attacked by a target that has frailty, you heal. So this is really cool and really consistent healing, especially for AoE packs, because you're going to be able to hit more targets with it. You're able to get more healing back from it. It's very nice, consistent healing. The only thing that is really determinant about how much you can get out of it is just how many soul fragments you can generate. So it's really nice, but it is a very consistent small trickle healing, whereas opposed to Fell Devastation, which is very in the moment bursty, so it really depends on what you need. If you're not really in danger of dying, maybe you would be better off taking Spirit Bomb. But the amount of damage and healing that Fell Devastation does when you need it is more important to me as a player. But pick whichever one you like. And then this is the most hotly debated topic of the whole damn tree, of the whole damn class, probably. Let's just go ahead and get it out of the way. You're never going to pick Nether Bond, ever. Ever. So just don't even think about it. It's going to be between Last Resort, which is basically a cheat death / purgatory. When you would normally receive a deathly blow, you are instead turned into meta. You gain 30%, just like you normally would get from meta, so you increase your max health and your current health, and that's awesome, right? So it's a cheat death that automatically activates your cooldown. And what's really awesome about Last Resort, about meta, and about Fueled by Pain is they all have separate cooldowns, which means that if I pop meta and then meta's over and then I immediately almost die, Last Resort will kick in and I don't have to worry about them clipping each other. Vice versa, I can Last Resort and then right as my Last Resort's about to run out, I can pop meta and then I can go again. And then also, if during your Last Resort meta or during your normal meta, if you were to proc your Fueled by Pain, which is very likely because you'll be doing more stuff, so you'll have the chance to consume more soul fragments, then it just adds on to the duration of these guys, so you're not wasting those procs either. It's so wonderful because they could have very easily have made any one of these things really shitty by having them override each other or just not work. But because they just add on to the duration, it's just awesome. So that's one of the really great benefits, and just having that cheat death. So if you're dealing with a pug and you're not sure how things are going to go, or if you are legitimately progressing on a difficult encounter or a difficult dungeon, or you want to try to game this and potentially just let yourself pull a bunch of stuff and die and then jump into meta, it's very unlikely that would happen. This is good. But in a situation where you're not ever going to be worried about dying, Last Resort is actually useless. So then there's Soul Barrier. Soul Barrier, basically you can shield yourself for an amount, and then while you're using Soul Barrier, if you absorb soul fragments, you absorb more basically. And so Soul Barrier is really, really good in situations pretty much where you're not going to be using Last Resort, right? So in a situation where you're not going to want to die because it's more damage reduction, which you would think is just absolutely amazing. And it is amazing. And it adds a lot to the class. The class kind of needs that one thing in between, its active mitigation ability and just something that just absorbs damage. So kind of like how warriors have shield block, but then they have ignore pain. It's so good together. And Soul Barrier is kind of like that as well. But it does take pain and it does take soul fragments to use, but it does count as absorbing those soul fragments. So it'll still count towards things like Feed the Demon, Pain Bringer, and Fueled by Pain. It'll count towards all of those guys. If you absorb those soul fragments for Soul Barrier, you will also get that stuff as well, which is cool. The only thing about Soul Barrier is I personally generally choose Last Resort. The only thing about Soul Barrier is it is another thing to manage, which is not that bad of a thing. It's another button to hit, which is not that bad either. But the idea, again, comes down to, and this is the way I rationalize it, and you'll rationalize it differently. The idea comes down to the fact that Soul Barrier is really purely a defensive ability. Outside of being able to proc like your meta, that's it. It's nothing but defensive, which is fine. There's obviously a point for defensive abilities, or demon spikes in a power ward wouldn't exist. But in a tier where you have a choice between taking it or something that just doesn't even consume these other resources so that you can just soul cleave, then if you're in a situation where you don't need that extra healing or that extra damage reduction, as the case may be, then you might be better off just doing more damage, which is it's a stretch, it's a reach, and I get it. But at the end of the day, you have to look at it from that mentality that we have whenever we have to hurt Warblades is it better for me to just be doing more damage, or is it better for me to have this barrier? Because I could use this pain and these soul fragments as a part of soul cleave, or is it better for me to use it as a part of Soul Barrier? And that's really the choice that you have to make, because you always still have the ability to soul cleave. The idea, though, is that if you're ever in a situation where you're at that 80 pain mark and you soul cleave, yeah, you get to do damage, but you do absorb all those soul fragments because you don't have a choice, and then you also get that heal, and God forbid you have Feast of Souls. That's a ton of overhealing, which is something you can't really control, and the amount of damage you do might offset it, might not. But with Soul Barrier, at least you're applying a damage absorption shield to yourself, which will eventually be eaten up at some point in time as long as you still take damage. So there's merits to both of these things, and there are obvious times where Last Resort will be good, and the obvious times where Last Resort will not be good, and in that case, Soul Barrier will likely be better. But then there's just using Soul Barrier, but just because you take Soul Barrier doesn't mean you have to use it in those situations. So there's a huge debate that goes back and forth, and I understand both arguments. I just typically run with Last Resort. But Soul Barrier is very good at the end of the day, so pick whichever one you like. And we'll just leave it at that before I go and just debate myself till the end of time. But I oftentimes ask myself about that as well, what I'm going to do. in terms of stats, right? So we'll talk about stats very briefly. All of your stats are pretty darn good, but there are some that are better than others. Basically, versatility is your best stat. The reason why is because it flat out increases the amount of damage that you do and the amount of healing that you receive, and reduces the amount of damage you take. So it's like the best tanking stat ever. 1, just straight up reduces your damage. 2, because of the fact that it increases your damage, it also will increase your healing done through Chart Warblades. Though it is important to note that it does not double dip, in the sense that when you heal from Chart Warblades, it does not increase the amount of healing. That the healing increase component of versatility does not affect the healing done from Chart Warblades. Only the damage increase component does, basically. But it's still very good because it doesn't double dip, but it kind of like 1.5 dips once you get Chart Warblades. So it becomes even more valuable of a stat for you. Though it's just really hard to find on gear. And then your next best stat is probably going to be Mastery in most situations. Mastery will increase the amount of physical damage reduction that your Demon Spikes does, and it also increases your attack power. So the only reason why it's not probably above versatility is because it doesn't have anything to do with magical damage reduction at all. But it does increase your attack power, which will increase your healing from Soul Cleave, and increase your damage done to targets, and increase your Chart Warblade stuff. So it's very good. Really, the only reason why it's not above your verse is just because it doesn't really deal with Mastery all that much. And then you have Crit, which will probably be next, which Crit will give you parry chance. It will also increase your damage, which will increase your healing, which is just good. And then finally you have Haste, which has no direct survivability component to it. Obviously, it is very good because it reduces the cooldown on Immolation Aura and Demon Spikes and Fellblade, if I'm not mistaken, which is great because those are defensive in nature. And then it also increases the amount of pain that you'll be able to generate because it increases the amount of buttons you'll be able to hit, and all that's super cool. But at the end of the day, and like again, all of your stats are good and they're all pretty darn close, but Haste is below all of them because of the fact that it doesn't have a direct survivability increase. But the way I like to look at it is much like when you're playing a healer, it's like Haste until comfortable, right? Until you can use your rotation, until you can hit your buttons, until you're not constantly spamming sheer when you have other things to press, because you need pain to either be able to use Demon Spikes or to be able to Soul Cleave to stay alive. That's the situation you don't want to be in, because then your other abilities are like your other stats are much less important at that point, because you're just spamming sheer to be able to get pain to do something. At that point, the other things don't really matter nearly as much. So I think that's pretty much everything. We covered everything: talents, stats, everything. The other thing I just wanted to say is like general tips and tricks for the spec. Please respect Demon Spikes. Use it often. You're going to see me use it a lot. I actually got a shout out from a healer and a random pug. They're like, holy shit. Literally, it was just like this. Didn't know this person. Dead quiet in chat. Doing my thing. And he says, holy shit. A demon hunter that actually uses spikes. I heard tales of the chosen one, but I didn't know. And he said it the best way I can possibly put it for this video is when you're if you're not using Demon Spikes, you're just a DPS that can heal, that's not doing nearly as much damage as they should be able to. That's pretty much it for the most part. If you're not using Demon Spikes, you're really not being a tank. So use Demon Spikes a lot, and then try to save your Soul Cleaves to when you're at 60 pain or more, because Soul Cleave will not do any more healing. Then you also give yourself the chance to build up soul fragments by using sheer, which will increase that portion of the heal as well, and it will do more damage. So just try to hold off and use Demon Spikes more and Soul Cleave a little less. And be super proactive and aggressive. Find good ways to use your sigils. They'll make you look like an absolute rock star in a dungeon if you use them correctly, and an absolute nub if you use them incorrectly, because people can tell when you drop your sigils, and they can tell when they're not effective. So just try to learn how to use those better, and just be proactive, be aggressive. This is a very aggressive tank. Like I said, always be looking for ways to do more damage, because you will be healing for more when you do that as well. You'll be helping your run and do more stuff that way. Another thing I've also had a big issue on is my trinkets. I finally got some better trinkets for my last night of tanking. I now have the Ichor trinket, which is very good. And I hesitate to tell you guys to go get specific trinkets, because specific trinkets can be really good depending on if they're Warforged, or they can be worse than stat sticks if the stat stick thing is Warforged. So I hesitate to say that, but I do have the Nightmare Ichor trinket, which is very good because it gives you versatility proc. You can kind of save it up by kiting the blobs if you want to, and I also have the Unleashed Fury, I think it is, which is just another last stand / meta, which is also very good too, and the stats on them are pretty decent. But basically, you're going to look for anything honestly, I would use some craft because I'm not a huge expert on trinkets, but pick things that have versatility procs and versatility of stats first and foremost, and then like just look out for good tanking procs at that point in time, and then whatever is really good stat wise for you. I've even used some of the leftover DPS trinkets that I have from Havoc, so like the spiked counterweight and the chaotic energies talisman or whatever it is, because sometimes at the end of the day, if you're still going to live, then it makes more sense to just do more damage. So I was actually doing a ton of damage when I was using those as well, and I didn't die. So I mean, at that point in time, what more can you ask for? But anyway, I know this was long, but I wanted to do another really in-depth guide like I did with my Blood DK guide. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Leave a comment and like below. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good day.